Welcome back to the Nest, peeps. In today's video, we are going to be painting the Death Archon. However, not only will I be painting the Death Archon, I also did a little bit of a kit bash. I tweaked things a little bit on the Death Archon because I wasn't a huge fan of just the cloak. I wanted something a little bit more ominous looking, a little bit more metal looking, so I made some alterations. It's really only one alteration. I guess if you count the green stuffing that I did, maybe you could push for two, but it's really just one alteration. I made an alteration on the Death Archon. It's going to be great. You're going to love it. So I'm not going to drag things out here. We're just going to jump right on into the project. On the box art to the Death Archon, you can see how it's traditionally supposed to look. I wanted to go in a different direction with it, so I wanted to do a head swap. Really, it's more so adding a head because this thing doesn't really have a head. So to do that, I have to cut the top of this cloak off and add this ram skull that I've decided to go with. So with that being said, let the blasphemy begin, and I begin to cut off the top part of this cloak. After that first cut, I decided to do a dry fit and see how this skull was going to lay on the sculpt. It looked a little weird, so I decided to come back in, cut off more of this cloak. The skull was still fitting a little wonky, and I realized that I had these two little nubbins on the back of it. So I took out the trusty snippers and I clipped them away. Then I came in with the X-Acto blade and shaved them flush. Then I came back to the sculpt and I decided to flush out the connection point a little bit better so that the skull had a spot to really connect to. And with a dry fit, you can see right here, that looks pretty decent. Now that we have everything cut down and fitting the way that we like, we get out the super glue and we attach this ram skull. The addition of this ram skull is without a doubt going to make this Death Archon unique. And now that the glue's all dry, we can see exactly what we're going to be working with here, and it definitely adds a little bit of character to this guy. However, the way that this skull butts up against the cloak looks a little off, so we're going to fix that with a little bit of green stuff. When I'm mixing up my green stuff, I like to add a little bit of water to it. This way it doesn't stick to my fingers and I'm fighting against the putty while I'm trying to sculpt. So what we're going to do here is pretty straightforward. I can't really recreate the hood because the horns are going to get in the way. So I opted to create more of a raised collar around the top of this cloak that butts up right directly against the skull. This will make it look like the cloak is wrapped around the skull, better incorporating it to the sculpt. However, in order to sell that, we have to make sure that this lays just right. That means allowing for little gaps in between the skull and the green stuff to make it look like the skull itself is recessed into the cloak, and by making sure we smooth out all of the edges, giving a seamless transition from the original sculpt into the collar that we added. And here is the model after I have finished the assembly. I think that this ram skull goes really nicely with the rest of this sculpt. And now that everything's put together, we can start painting this model. Off screen, I primed the Death Archon and gave it a zenithal highlight. And here you can see I'm just going to paint the cloak black again. I want this cloak to read as a very dark purple, so the way that I'm going to do this is with a dry brush of scale 75 violet. This is a dark and saturated purple, and by dry brushing it directly onto the black base coat, we're going to get a maximum amount of contrast out of this fairly dark purple. And since I want this cloak to read as a very dark purple, I'm not going to be doing any highlights past this violet. Due to the wings and the horns that I added, dry brushing wasn't really an option for the upper portion of this cloak around the skull, so I had to come in with a regular brush and just pick out those highlights the old-fashioned way. This also gives us the opportunity to mask any of the alterations that we made. To me, death is a shade, so anything on this model that wasn't bone or cloth, I wanted to look like a shadow. And I wasn't really sure how I was going to achieve that, but I knew the first step was base coating all of that in black. On the sculpt, it looks like the hands are supposed to be gloved, but I decided to paint those as shadow as well. I had thought about painting them as bone, but I figured that would clash with the scythe a little too much. After determining all of the areas that I wanted to represent manifest shadow, I came in and gave all those areas a second coat of black, further defeating the purpose of the zenithal prime. I mix a drop or two of black into some cold gray, and I load that up onto my dry brush. Now, I take this dry brush and I try to hit all the raised edges of these wings to try and give depth to what I'm trying to make look like a shadow. It's a really weird thing to try and paint. I also take that same cold gray black mixture and I give a dry brush to the hands, because these are also supposed to be shadow, and highlighting shadow is a strange endeavor. Next, I load up my dry brush with some pure Vallejo Game Color Cold Gray. And with this, I'm aiming just for the centermost portions of these wings. With this, we're trying to accent all of the folds in the wings in an attempt to give shadows some depth. This ended up giving the wings more of a smoke vibe than a shadow vibe, but I dig it and I'm going to roll with it. Now that we've got the wings sorted, it's time to paint all the bone areas on this Death Archon, and we're going to start off with the sides. And for this base coat, we're going to be using Vallejo Model Color Iraqi Sand. I'm going to be using the same recipe I traditionally use when painting bone, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. While base coating the bone sections on these wings, it turned out to be a little bit more tedious than I had previously anticipated. This is mostly due to the fact that I needed to take my time when painting these areas. I didn't want to get any of this Iraqi sand onto any of the inner wing portions that we've already established. Once that was done, I came in and I base coated the horns with some Vallejo Game Color Heavy Brown. Because we went through the trouble of kit bashing this and adding the skull, I really want these horns to stand out from the rest of the bone areas in the model and draw the viewer's attention to the head. I got this P3 brush in that mystery box that I got last year. However, the tip to it was kind of jacked up, so I decided to cut that off and turn it into a little dry brush, and the thing works fantastically for that purpose. I loaded this brush up with some Vallejo Game Color Off-White, and as you can see here, it really allows me to get into those smaller spaces and avoid getting paint in any areas that we don't want an off-white highlight. And there are quite a few tight spaces on this model that I want to be bone, so I'm glad I have this tiny little dry brush in my toolbox. Once I got all the little pain in the butt areas out of the way, I switched out to my larger makeup brush, and starting with the scythes, I begin to highlight the remainder of the bone areas. However, the inner portion of the wings being so recessed, the dry brush really couldn't reach it. Even the smaller dry brush couldn't get in there. So I came in with my standard brush and sketched in some rough highlights using that Vallejo Off-White. And then I come back to add some detail to the horns. Now my goal here is to make it look like the horns are fading into a shadow or slowly morphing into shadow to better match our wings and hands, while also adding some visual interest. To achieve this, I painted the tips of the horns black and I wet blended some of that heavy brown into it, creating a smooth transition from that heavy brown at the bottom of the horns to the pure black at the tip, with the hopeful result of the horns looking like they are slowly transitioning into a shadow state. As is typical when it comes to wet blending, this took a fair amount of futzing and going back and forth between the pure black and the heavy brown until I got a transition that I was happy with. Once I was satisfied with the transition, I came in with some Iraqi sand and began to add the highlights to these horns, starting with a straight edge highlight down the center of each horn, then picking out the rest of the texture that is on these horns. I'm taking my time with this and I'm only adding the Iraqi sand to the lower brown portion. For the upper section of these horns, we're going to take some of that Vallejo Game Color Cold Gray and we're going to edge highlight the tips of each of the horns to echo what we did with the hands and the wings. Next, I take some Army Painter Leather Brown and I begin to cut in all of the ropes, taking my time and trying not to get any of this paint on the surrounding areas. Moving over to the metallics, we're going to start things off with some Vallejo Game Color Gunmetal, and we're going to apply this to the pauldrons and all of the arm cuffs. I had also decided to paint the rim of this hourglass on the side in the gunmetal. At this point, I wasn't really sure where I was going with the hourglass, but I figured that this was a good start. Once I had finished base coating all the metallic areas I wanted in gunmetal, I moved over to Vallejo Game Color Brassy Brass and I began to pick out all of the trim on the armor pieces. This brass color is the perfect base coat for the golden highlights that we're going to be adding to it later. For these little medallions that are hanging off the front of the Death Archon, I decided to paint them with the gunmetal and then come in and pick out the details with our brassy brass. For all of the areas that we painted in that gunmetal, we're going to take some platinum silver from Vallejo Game Color and apply some highlights, kind of combining the two worlds of true metallic metals and non-metallic metals. The big upside to this method is that since you're painting it with metallics, the light you're using to paint is going to reflect off of the surface, showing you exactly where your highlights need to go. Then we take some glorious gold from Vallejo Game Color and we apply the same concepts to all the trim areas that we painted in the brassy brass earlier. When it comes to the glorious gold over top of the brassy brass, it's a little bit more stark than with the silvers that we used, so I got to be more careful not to blow out the brass base coat. The beauty of painting gold this way is that it really allows it to pop off of the model. That being said, you could probably get away without doing any of this metallic highlighting and still get a fantastic end result that would look amazing on the tabletop. Now, I wanted to make the blades on these sides look magical, so I decided to go with some Turbo Dork shell-shocked color shifting paint. In order to get this paint to show up properly off screen, I had base coated each of these side blades black. I decided to make these little tassels red, so I started things off with some Vallejo model color dark red for my base coat. Again, taking our time as to not get any of this red on the cloak. Right after I had finished with the base coat on these tassels, I came up with the idea of painting the inside of this hourglass with the same shell shock that's on the sides to create a little triangle of interest there. So I base coated the inside of this hourglass in black in preparation for the shell shocked. And then back to the tassels. Here I am adding a rough highlight of Vallejo model color light orange. And back to the hourglass. Here I am just applying that Turbo Dork shell shocked paint to the black area that we base coated earlier. And it's time to start applying our washes. The first wash that we apply is the Strong Tone wash from Army Painter, and we're going to put that on all of our ropes. Next wash is the Army Painter Soft Tone wash, and we're going to be applying this to all of the bone areas, starting with the scythe. On areas like the rib cage here, I like to come in kinda heavy with the wash to make sure that it recesses deep in between those ribs. While I'm applying the wash to the head, I'm trying to be careful as to not have any spillover onto the purple or to not have any tide marks onto the front of the skull. I had also decided to go with the soft tone wash on the horns. Then we apply the wash to the bone areas of the wing, and this is pretty straightforward, no real special techniques or tricks for this. Just come in here and put down the wash. You have to be a little bit more careful when you're in the inner parts of these wings here, but really your hand just kind of flows naturally with the shape of the wing. Up next is the Army Painter Dark Tone Wash, and we first are going to take this to all of the metallic areas on this sculpt, both the silvers and the golds that we did. Since the areas we're hitting with this wash are so exposed, we don't have to be as meticulous with it and can be a little bit more haphazard. We also apply this dark tone wash to the inner portion of our wings. This will knock down some of that gray dry brushing that we did earlier and make it a little bit darker, help pushing it towards that whole shadow feel that I'm going for. I decided to lean into the magical blade thing, so we're going to make the edges of these blades glow. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to lay down a base coat of cold gray from Vallejo Game Color. And we are going to follow that up with an edge highlight of dead white from Vallejo Game Color. As you have probably guessed, we are laying the foundation for fluorescent paints. After getting the blades prepped, I decided I wanted the eyes to glow too, so here I'm just filling the eye cavity with some Vallejo Dead White. Due to this Death Archon primarily being for my minions army, I decided to go with the fluorescent magenta again. And we're going to take this magenta and just glaze it over top of that white base coat that we've already established. And then I take some of that magenta and I fill in the eye cavities to give us that glowing eye effect that we're going for. And lastly, I come in with some Vallejo off-white and I pick out all the teeth on this model. The teeth on the ram skull, the teeth on the belt, and even the teeth on the sides. You could probably get away without highlighting the teeth, but I wanted to break things up a bit due to the amount of bone that is on this model. I did the base off screen because this video was already long enough. It's pretty simple. All it is that sand mixture that I normally use with a dark tone wash, and then I added some dead grass tufts. I also added some tombstones to the base that I made out of epoxy sculpt. Fairly simple to do. If you've ever played with Play-Doh, you can make a tombstone. Turned out pretty badass, right? Yeah, I'm a big fan of, well, the Death Archon in general because it's a beast, but also how this thing looks. I absolutely love it. I feel like the ram skull that I added to this kind of gives it more of a menacing and ominous appearance on the field, which is fitting for the Death Archon. It's very ominous. It's death. Just gonna get you. So what do you think of this model? Do you like the modifications I did to it? Or are you a purist and am I a blasphemer for altering the sculpt? Let me know in the comment section down below. With that, I bid you farewell. I shall see you in the next one, and as always, keep on painting, peeps.